What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? As always, thank you for joining me. My name's Paul Brettel, the site editor over at Dairyland Express, where we cover the Packers, Brewers, Bucks, and Badgers. I also have a new article out every Monday and Friday over at Cheesehead TV. And as it says at the bottom of the screen here, you can find me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. So the main topic of discussion today is going to be on the Green Bay Packers' newest cornerback, Isaac Yiadom, who they acquired on Tuesday in a trade with the New York Giants for Josh Jackson in return. After we get through that, I'm going to go through some observations just quickly from the last week, whether it's from the preseason game, the practices that have followed, just some important, noteworthy things that have stood out to me. But first, Isaac Yaidom. So I have an article up right now over at Dairyland Express where I cover 5 things to know about the Green Bay Packers' newest cornerback. First up is that he was a third-round pick in the 2018 draft by the Denver Broncos at pick 99. If you'll recall, Josh Jackson, of course, was the Green Bay Packers' second-round selection that year. Before I get into Yaidom, I just want to briefly speak on Josh Jackson. I mean, to put it simply, it was time to move on. That Saturday preseason game against Houston was completely evidence of that. I know that maybe we're holding out hope that the new defensive system, having a new defensive coordinator in Joe Barry, would help revitalize Josh Jackson's career. But that Houston Texans game was an example of it's his time here had run its course and it was time to move on. It didn't matter who the quarterback was for Houston, who the receiver was lined up for Josh Jackson. It was clear they were going after him. He was targeted 10 times during that game. He gave up 7 receptions for 91 yards, I believe. It was just the same issues that have been there since he was a rookie are still there to today, the lack of development. And that game was clear that if you're holding out hope that he was going to be on this roster, that was it. That was the final nail in the coffin, as they say. The Green Bay Packers were going to cut him. So in turn, they were able to at least get someone for him in return in Isaac Yaidom, who honestly is kind of in a similar situation as Josh Jackson is, in that he has not lived up to that third-round selection of his. He was drafted by Denver in 2018, spent 2018 and 2019 there, and then last summer he was traded to the New York Giants, where he spent last season. So now he's on his his third team in 4 seasons. And Vic Fangio, the Denver Broncos head coach, just before Yaidom was traded, he was asked about him by a reporter, and in the article, there's a paragraph here where Fangio goes into more detail, but I'm just going to read one sentence of it, and I think it really says everything. He has to improve in all facets of his game. That's what Vic Fangio said. So I know it can be exciting for a fan base to see an early round selection coming to their team, whether it's off waivers, free agency, via trade. But Yaidom is far from a roster lock. If we consider Jair, Kevin King, Eric Stokes, Shamar John Charles, and Shannon Sullivan as roster locks, if they keep just 6 cornerbacks, which they did the season ago, that leaves only one spot open. And Yaidom is going to have to come in here and prove that he deserves that spot over KB Ento, who's playing very well, especially over the last few weeks. He had a very good family night performance. He had a very good performance against the Texans, coming away with an interception. And then on top of that, he's a special teams contributor as a gunner as well. So Yaidom is far from a roster lock. He's going to come in and have to really earn that spot. And honestly, at this time, if you ask me, is he going to be on the roster or off come week 1? I would guess that he is going to be off. Next up, in things to know about Isaac Yaidom, he had a relative athletic score from the combine of 6.14. So if you're unfamiliar with the relative athletic score, or RAS as it goes by, what it is it's a way to, on a 0 to 10 scale, compare players' athleticism within their respective position groups. So at the combine, we know there's the vertical jump, the broad jump, the 40, height, weight, bench press. There's a number of different measurements that the players go through. So this scale is an easy, digestible way for us to compare the athleticism of those players. Because what if one player has a higher broad jump, but the other person has a higher vertical jump? How do you compare those? So Kent Lee Platte, who designed this formula, gave us this easy way to do so. And it's only compared within your position groups. So you might see a center with a score of 9.2 and a receiver with a score of 9.2 as well. And it's because, like the name says, it's all relative. That receiver score is compared among just receivers, and the center is compared among just centers. So for Isaac Yaidom posting a 6.14, that shows that he's just slightly above average when it comes to athleticism among cornerbacks. And that's very noticeable. Jackson, for example, was a 9.2 or 9.3, I believe, which is considered elite. However, with Jackson, what really stood out was the lack of speed. That was actually his 4.56 40 time was below average. And going back to Jackson, I think that's what a lot of his issues stemmed from, was that speed. So with Yaidom, it's important to note that he's not overall athletic. His 40 time was 4.52, so he's not the fastest player either. But unlike Jackson, who scored really well in the vertical and the broad in those other measurements, Yaidom struggled, or I shouldn't say struggled, but he was just slightly above average in most of those benchmarks. So nothing in particular about his game stands out. And in an article from Sports Illustrated by Patricia Traina, she covers the Giants for SI. One thing that she notes is that he has Yaidom lacks twitch, fluidity, and short area quickness. So again, he's on his third team in 4 seasons. He's a cornerback, and a lot of that does stem from coverage issues, which, from the sounds of it, and not that I've deep dived into his tape or anything like that by any means, but it sounds like the speed could be an issue, similarly to what we saw with Josh Jackson. Next up with Yaidom, and these two kind of together, is that quarterbacks have been very efficient against him during his career. So he's been targeted 142 times. He's allowed a completion rate of 67%, pretty high. 13.3 yards per catch with 9 touchdowns, just 1 interception, 9 pass breakups, and 8 penalties. So for comparison's sake, Josh Jackson, and Jackson has 300 less career snaps than Yaidom. His completion rate is 69% compared to the 67. He's given up 6 touchdowns, doesn't have any interceptions. However, he does have 12 pass breakups to Yaidom's 9, but he has 13 penalties to Yaidom's 8. So as you can see, as we're going through each of these items, there's definitely parallels between these two players. So that's why I said in the beginning, Yaidom's far from a roster lock on this Green Bay Packers team. Next up, we'll get into some of the positives. One is that he does have special teams experience, 489 snaps. As I've talked about on here before, as I've written about often, many of these back end of the roster decisions are going to come down to whether or not you can contribute on special teams. If you're the 6th cornerback, the 7th, 6th receiver, the 4th or 5th edge rusher, you're likely not going to see a lot of playing time on the offensive or defensive side of the ball. So you better be able to contribute on special teams. So Yaidom does have that experience. By PFF's grading system, which I know it's not the be-all, end-all, but he's graded out very average in that regard. I also spoke with Richard Silva, who covers the Giants for G-Men HQ over at Fansided, and he kind of echoed similar sentiments to what the PFF grades show, essentially saying that Yaidom didn't really stand out. So take that could be a positive because he's not really a liability out there, but he's not doing anything spectacular either to draw your attention. He's steady, and there's something to be said for that. That's not a knock. I think given what we've seen from this Green Bay Packers special teams unit over the years, I think a lot of us would take 12 steady or 11 steady players on the football field on that special teams unit. So that's a positive for him in that regard. Lastly is run support. Yaidom is actually a very strong run defender. And this is something that was noted about him coming out of Boston College, that was actually a strength of his game. According to Pro Football Focus by run defense grade, last season with the Giants, he ranked 28th out of 100 eligible cornerbacks. Once again, Patricia Traina, she mentioned that he was the 2nd best run defender in the secondary last season for the New York Giants, and noted that he's physical, aggressive, and shows good tackling mechanics. So having a strong, reliable tackler in your secondary, that's always a positive, and that appears to be a strength of Yaidom's game. So those were the 5 areas, parts of his game that I wanted to cover and shed some light on, areas that he needs to improve upon, where he struggled, but also some positive as well, to try to help paint the full picture of who he is as a player. And like I said, I have this up at Dairyland Express. I have much more quotes in that article as well than what I read off here. I was just trying to get the highlights to help illustrate the points I was making, but I go more in depth with those quotes that I received from those individuals who cover the Giants in the article. So please head over there to check that out as well. I also got a link to that article in the below here in the YouTube video. So now let's transition to some observations from this past week. And I know I wasn't able to get to a video right after the game. I wish I could have. Hopefully, I'll be able to do that after the Jets game here. So some of these will go back to that a little bit. But I want to start with Oren Burks. Oren Burks, honestly, entering that Texans game was in a kind of a pretty similar boat to Josh Jackson. Drafted in 2018, struggled when on the field, struggled to see playing time to begin with. But for as bad as Josh Jackson was in that game, Oren Burks was just as good on the other end of that spectrum. Finished the game with 7 tackles, 2 pressures, and a sack. He also had another tackle added on special teams. And what I thought was really interesting in all of that was how aggressive Joe Barry was in using him. Oren Burks was sent on a number of blitzes. I've gone back and rewatched the game, and I wish I would have, but I didn't count how many blitzes Oren Burks was sent on. But I have to imagine it was at least 4 or 5. And he really thrived in that role. That's how one of his sacks came off of. Both of his pressures were off of those blitzes. So if he can grow into that role, because it uses that speed of his, and that was what was so attractive to him coming out of Vanderbilt, was that speed that he possessed at the linebacker position, and that was hopefully supposed to translate to coverage abilities as well, especially as a former safety. We just haven't seen that. So being aggressive, playing downhill, and Oren Burks has noted this summer that he's reading and reacting quicker, and that's always been an issue of his, that hesitation. I still think back to the 2019 training camp where they were doing one-on-one drills and he was covering Aaron Jones out of the backfield. There wasn't any offensive lineman. It was just Aaron Jones, Oren Burks, and a quarterback. And Burks just stuck with him in coverage. And we all know how effective Aaron Jones has been as a pass catcher out of the backfield. So that's not an easy task to do. But Burks, when all of that extra noise, everything was out of the way, and he was just solely focused on Aaron Jones, and he just reacted to what Jones did, that athleticism showed up, that coverage ability showed up. It's definitely there, but we just need to see it more. So hopefully this was a sign of things to come with him, because he has that speed, and I love how Joe Barry utilized him as a blitzer. It's not something we ever saw Mike Pettin do with Oren Burks. So maybe that's something definitely to keep our eyes on these next couple preseason games, see if that's something that the Green Bay Packers try to take advantage of again. But for Oren Burks, this is fantastic news. He's someone that in my previous roster predictions, I did not have him on the roster at all. I thought he was going to be a cut, but if I had to put one together today, I would absolutely put him on. Now, the important thing for Burks is that he has to continue showing this. Not that he's necessarily going to post a 7 sack, 2 pressure, or 7 tackle, 2 pressure, 1 sack performance again, because like I said, that was a very impressive game. But we need to see that consistency. We need to see him playing downhill, that playmaking ability on display. And if he can continue doing that, I don't know how you keep him off the roster, especially with what he adds to the special teams unit, because he has been one of the Green Bay Packers' better special teams contributors these last couple seasons. So very impressed with Oren Burks. Hopefully we see that play moving forward from him. Number 2, the safety depth. We know about Adrian Amos. We know about Darnell Savage, but there's a lot of inexperience behind those guys. We also know about Will Redmond, but he's been on the non-football injury list, just recently returned to practice, I believe last week it was. But Ennis Gaines, Vernon Scott, and Henry Black, they showed out during the Houston game as well. Scott and Black were all over the field. They both played a lot of snaps, and they were making tackles at the line of scrimmage in the middle of the field. They had 11 combined tackles between the two of them. They were both very good on special teams, and same for Ennis Gaines as well. He was signed in January. I think it really flew under the radar because the Packers were still in the playoffs at the time, but he was signed to a futures deal. And he went undrafted in 2020 out of TCU, wasn't on an NFL roster last year, but he's really impressed as well throughout training camp, not just against the Texans, but throughout training camp. He's really flashed, solid special teams player. I wrote an article about him over at Dairyland Express, so someone to keep your eyes on, but have to be really impressed with this safety group and the depth behind Amos and Savage. And right now, Will Redmond, he better string some good practices together, because the way those 3 are playing, he might be the odd man out when it comes to setting that 53-man roster prediction. Now let's transition to the receiver position. And my big question here is, do the Green Bay Packers keep 6 receivers or do they keep 7? I've been pretty adamant, and I still lean this way, that I just find it hard to believe that they would keep 7 receivers. The 5 receivers that we know are locks are going to get a ton of targets. They have Robert Tonyan, Mercedes Lewis, Josiah DeGuara at the tight end position. They have A.J. Dillon, Aaron Jones out of the backfield. This team is not lacking pass catching options. But after Saturday's preseason game, I am more open to entertaining the idea of keeping 7 receivers than what I was before. Devin Funchess had a heck of a game. He's really building off of some strong practices that he's put together. But do you know who else had a really good game? Malik Taylor caught all 5 of his 5 targets for 50 yards, I believe. He's a gunner on special teams. He also had 2 key blocks on wide receiver screens to Amari Rodgers, which can't be overlooked as well. We know how important that blocking ability at the receiver position is to Matt LaFleur. So if the Green Bay Packers keep 6 receivers, it's hard to envision with how well he played in that game and those few practices that they would keep Devin Funchess off. But then with the 6 receivers that you have outside of Amari Rodgers returning punts, you don't really have any special teams contributors. You know, Malik Taylor is someone who can be a gunner for you, can come off the edge on field goal punt units to try to block the kick. So you don't have that in the receiver position without him. So is that special teams ability, and he took 210 special team snaps last year, is that enough for the Green Bay Packers to keep him on the roster? If it is, they'll have to keep 7 receivers. And that's where I think the predicament for them lies. And that's a good problem to have. If you're a coach, you want to have to choose between having too many potential contributors to choose from. One thing to tie the safety group into this receiver position, since we're discussing both of them, if the Green Bay Packers do keep Vernon Scott, Henry Black, and his games, all 3 of those guys are special teams contributors. So perhaps that provides them the flexibility that they don't need to keep a special teams contributor at the receiver position if you're getting 3 from your safety group. So that's a balancing act to factor in all of this as well. But I think this receiver cut down is going to be really interesting when we get to these final roster predictions. So I still think that they keep 6. I just can't envision them going 7. But the way Funchess played, the way Malik Taylor played, plus his special teams contributions, I like I said, I'm more willing to have that conversation now than what I would have been a week ago. Because a week ago, I probably just would have shut it down right away. Lastly, last little topic I want to discuss is the offensive line, specifically the guard positions. So the offensive line play last Saturday was brutal. Nathaniel Hackett, the offensive coordinator, to put simply, he called it very bad. The play was very bad. The Green Bay Packers, specifically against the run, they only averaged 2.3 yards per carry. Adam Stenavich, the offensive line coach, we know that there's a battle going on for those 2 guard spots, and it's been between Ben Braden, John Runyon, and Lucas Patrick. But Stenavich on Sunday told reporters that nobody's really ran away with that. And so on Monday at practice, and then again on Wednesday, we saw rookie Royce Newman thrown into that mix as well. So from the looks of it, there's now 4 guards competing for those 2 spots. Newman played both guard positions and both tackle positions during his time at Ole Miss. During OTAs and minicamp, he got starting reps with the ones at right tackle, right guard, and left guard. So he's been out there these last 2 practices with the team, and by the looks of it, he's thrown into that mix as well. So we're going to continue to see a rotation between those 4 players, but it appears to be wide open for week 1. And as Matt LaFleur has told us numerous times in the past, his goal is to put the best 5 offensive linemen on the field. And now Royce Newman's going to have an opportunity to try to prove that he is one of those best 5. And I have to, just a quick tangent on Lucas Patrick. My hope is that the Green Bay Packers still keep him, because last season, as good as this offensive line unit was, we saw the importance of depth, because they dealt with a number of injuries over the course of the season. Guys were in and out of the lineup. Guys were changing positions. But from week to week, this group still performed as one of the best in football. So we know the importance of offensive line depth. But my hope is that is kept in mind, because I do see a realistic world where Green Bay could move on from Lucas Patrick. They can save about $2 million in cap space by doing so. Perhaps they feel that they could trade him for a draft pick or something in return. But I think that's something worth keeping our eyes on, and how that progresses, how he plays over the next few preseason games, because he might not just be fighting for a starting spot. he might be fighting for his job here on this team if they feel comfortable enough with the overall interior depth that they have. So keep your eyes on Lucas Patrick as well as Royce Newman and John Runny and Ben Braden for that matter, because those 2 guard spots are wide open. So that's what I have for you guys today. As always, thank you for joining me. You can find me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. You can find all my work at Dairyland Express and Cheesehead TV. Until next time, friends, take care, stay safe, and go Pack Go.